Hi, I'm Dana, and making content online, I of course get lots of comments from lots of different people, and one of the overwhelming things that I see discussed more so than announced is whether or not all autistic people are traumatised. And I think it's a really interesting discussion topic. That's why I'm making a video. This is purely just my opinion and my thoughts. I'm not trying to say that anybody's right or wrong, I'm just putting my 2 cents in because I think it's an interesting discussion. And I want to kind of start by validating the idea because I do feel like in the majority of online autistic communities, it does seem as though we're all traumatised. And I think that is because we're in autistic online communities, I think that a lot of people who haven't been through much trauma and who don't have the anxieties and the hypervigilance and everything that comes along with it are probably in real life communities and are doing things out in the world and the I'm not trying to shit on the people like myself who are having to turn to online places because I just can't function in that way. I think it's perfectly valid, I think it's perfectly fair, I understand why we do it and I'm a part of it, but I do also think that there's lots and lots of autistic people that aren't traumatised. It's just that we all sort of group together in an online space where we can relate to each other and feel understood, and I think that's entirely understandable. I feel like most humans just want to feel understood and like we belong somewhere, and we're able to find that in online spaces much easier than we would in the real world, I suppose. I've worked very, very hard on trying to build a real life in-person community, and I'm not doing all that great at it, to be honest with you. I've got 2 people that are my community, my very close friends, the people I adore, but there's also lots of people sort of on the fringes and people that I vaguely know through them that I feel could get to that place and who are autistic and who aren't traumatised, and they are doing that in real life and in person in those spaces. And I don't, they might be lurking on here somewhere, but I feel like they're not because they don't need this type of thing. And I also think that it's not necessarily that they haven't experienced trauma, it's more so just that it isn't affecting them in the same way that it affects a lot of us. Or perhaps just different types of trauma affecting people in different ways, every situation is so complex and nuanced and entirely its own that applying my black and white autistic thinking isn't going to help anything, But it was meeting those people and having those experiences of seeing autistic people who are doing really well and really coping with life quite well, or at least from the outside perspective of someone that doesn't know them well, seems to really be doing good and is quite inspiring and quite not in I don't like using the term inspiring because I do feel it often sort of boils down to the whole inspiration porn type of thing, and it's wow, an autistic person can do something. Or it's obviously coming from another autistic person. I'm just oh shit, so I probably can do that thing, It's just kind of validating more so than inspiring, I suppose. But I very much did have the opinion when starting this channel and when first researching about autism and that everybody who's autistic is also at least a little bit traumatised. And I'm not saying it's not true, but I do feel from the experiences that I've had of getting to know other types of autistic people in real life and experiencing, those types of friendships and learning about them and knowing about them, it has sort of shown me that a lot of people get support that I didn't really understand was possible, as an autistic person with very black and white thinking that I do work on, I do try to see the nuance and see the grey area, but I have to really actively try to do it, it's not something that comes naturally to me. My natural thought process is very, very black and white. So it can sort of feel sometimes I struggle to imagine any sort of situation that's not my own and imagine any sort of lifestyle that's not my own. And it was very eye-opening for me to see autistic people who have really loving, supportive families who really understand their accommodation needs and their accessibility needs and, really work around them and did their best for them. It was completely foreign and unimaginable to me until I saw that it happens. So when we're saying oh, all autistic people are a little bit traumatised, I feel it's not necessarily damaging, but definitely not a good thing, because there are absolutely the people out there that have had really great families or at least really great support systems who have had support from, if not their family, then the government and the my oldest brother was diagnosed autistic in childhood, and it meant that we as a family accommodated a lot of things around his needs, and he had social workers, he had extra help at school, he got quite a lot of support. And as far as I know, I don't speak to my family, but as far as I know, he's doing pretty all right, I don't feel he's a traumatised person despite having raised us in the same household, because his needs were met as an autistic person and mine weren't because I was undiagnosed. And I think especially when there can be that kind of difference even in the same family, when we're all having completely different families and upbringings and everything, some people probably actually aren't a little bit traumatized. They're probably actually autistic and completely fine. And I don't feel like it's like the biggest number ever, but I feel that will also be because a lot of people who are able to mask, who are able to function in the way that I and a lot of others am, they won't have been diagnosed because they're doing okay, you know? Like, my diagnosis largely came around because I could not function in life. I was absolutely just rotting. I couldn't do anything. Everything in the world made me so anxious. I didn't feel like I understood anything. I just constantly questioned what was wrong with me. And that led me down all of the rabbit holes that it took to eventually be diagnosed autistic in my early 20s. If I'd been doing okay, if I'd had a support system that allowed me to get through education, allowed me to get a decent job, you know, things like that, I probably would have never found out that I'm autistic. I'd just be like, oh, sometimes I get really tired and every now and again this happens, you know? Some traits would definitely still be there. You can't just get rid of being autistic by being supported. Some traits would absolutely still be there, but I would have an easier time with things. And as someone who is able to, like, or at least used to be able to mask quite well and is capable of quite a lot of things, I don't feel like I'd have been diagnosed if I'd been in a better situation growing up and into my teen years, you know? So with that in mind, I think that there's probably a hell of a lot of autistic people who are completely untraumatized and simply don't know or don't care that they're autistic. Like, I have had conversations with people where they've brought up to me, like, because I do this and everything, they've brought up to me that they think they probably are autistic or they share a lot of things in common with autistic people and have a lot of autistic traits. And it does tend to be people where I'm like, yeah, I think you're autistic. You seem hella fucking similar to me. And they just don't feel any need to actually, like, confirm it or find out or do research into it because they're doing okay. You know, they have a support system, they have good people in their lives, they have things going on for them that allow them to survive and get by. And there's just no reason for them to add another, like, facet of things into their life by going for an autism diagnosis. And I think that they largely are the people that are autistic and untraumatized, are the people that don't know and don't need to know if they're autistic. But all that being said, as I said, like, I find this discussion interesting because as much as I'm like, lots of autistic people aren't traumatized, lots of people actually have it okay and have support systems, I do think that as autistic people, we are largely, through having the autistic traits that count towards being autistic, we're more likely to be traumatized, we're more likely to end up in abusive situations, we're more likely to just generally feel traumatized by the world around us because we don't understand it. Like, that's very much my experience. Like, as much as, like, I've always said that I've had a neglectful family because they did neglect a lot of things, but there's been more stories that I've shared with friends where they've been like, shit, Dana, and I'm like, oh yeah, that's actually quite a traumatic thing for my family to do. So to a point I had like a neglectful and abusive family. I moved out at 16 to live with my very abusive boyfriend for the next 8 years. And I do feel like so much of it is that I came across as an easy target. I don't understand what's happening in the world around me. It takes me quite a long time to, like, process anything that happens around me or happens to me. You know, I feel like I just, in a lot of ways, am a really easy target for a lot of things. And I definitely think that it's largely because of the autistic traits that I have. I am quite naive, I am quite gullible, you know? I tend to believe people when they tell me things because I don't really get why people would lie. I just tell the truth, it's so much easier, why are you lying? And they're all things that I do feel like make it easier for me to end up in situations that can be traumatic. So as much as I don't think that, like, every autistic person is guaranteed to be traumatised, I do think that it will be a much, much higher number than in a lot of other groups, because we are just sort of, like, so predisposed to it and an easy target for a lot of people that want to put us in traumatic situations. And I think I also touched on the fact of, like, things that other people don't find to be traumatic, I can find, like, really quite difficult to deal with. Like, I was quite horrifically bullied in high school, but it's some of, like, the really small offhanded comments that came from friends that they didn't even really mean to be nasty or cruel or mean or whatever that have really stuck with me, and I feel, like, sort of traumatised by and, like, pop up in my brain and have definitely worked into how I've tried to form myself as a human being. Like, so many things that probably shouldn't be a bit traumatic and a bit are for me, and that's just the way my brain works and the way things happen. And I also think that some of it is that we recently discussed on this channel that autistic people perhaps, like, think more in memories than a lot of neurotypical people do. So whilst someone might experience something traumatic and be able to sort of move on and get over it at some point, not even necessarily particularly quickly, but at some point they don't think about that thing anymore. Whereas I don't feel like I have any control over the fact that, like, I will have memories that are connected to things, like everyone does, don't get me wrong, but everything has a memory for me. Every action, every thought, everything in the world triggers a really vivid memory in my mind. So it is going to, like, sort of make my trauma pop up more often in my day-to-day life than it might for a lot of other people. Like, I do feel like even if I've experienced very similar things to a non-autistic person, it just takes me so much longer to deal with it and get over it and process it and just generally like be a person about it, you know? But that is the video for today. That's all I've got to say about this. Like I say, I've seen it mentioned quite a few times in my comments, and I just think that it's like genuinely an interesting discussion to have. And I don't know if I necessarily think it's like the most important one to have, but I do think it's interesting, and I do feel like discussions like this can really help people figure things out about themselves and figure out ways to accommodate to ourselves and figure out just sort of what's gone on in a lot of ways. So I do hope someone's found it useful. If you want to see more content from me, I post here on Tuesdays, Thursdays and Sundays. I post over on TikTok daily, and I'll link that down below if you want to go and follow me there. And I also post quite sporadically over on Instagram. If you want to donate some money to me for the content that I create, you can do that over on Patreon or Ko-fi. They will also be linked down in the little drop bar thing below if you want to do that. But for now, whoever you are, wherever you are, if you have a lovely morning, evening, day, afternoon, week, month, year, and I will see you again in a couple of days.